Serial killers aren't just characters in horror movies. They're terrifyingly real, leaving scars on history that never fade. Today, we'll look in the haunting stories of 10 of the most horrifying serial killers whose crimes still send shivers down spines. From twisted motives to chilling methods, these stories will leave you questioning everything. First on our list, we have Pedro Lopez, a man whose reign of terror across South America earned him the name the Monster of the Andes. Imagine a man so monstrous that he confessed to murdering over 300 young girls. A man who preyed on innocents across 3 countries, leaving behind a trail of unimaginable horror. This isn't a story from fiction. This is the horrifying reality of Pedro Lopez, the man infamously known as the Monster of the Andes. Pedro Alonso Lopez was born on October 8, 1948, in Colombia, into a life of poverty and hardship. His early years were a cocktail of neglect, abuse, and trauma, experiences that shaped the monster he would later become. Lopez was the 7th of 13 children, born to a prostitute mother who exposed him to a world of violence and exploitation from an early age. At just 8 years old, Lopez's life took a darker turn when he was caught fondling his younger sister. His punishment? Being thrown out of the house. Homeless and vulnerable, Lopez roamed the streets, only to fall into the clutches of a man who offered him shelter. But instead of safety, Lopez found himself kidnapped and repeatedly assaulted, a horrific experience that would leave deep psychological scars. As a teenager, Lopez drifted into petty crime, stealing to survive and eventually landing in prison. It was during this time that he claimed to have killed his first victims, fellow inmates who had sexually assaulted him. This was just the beginning of his descent into a life of unthinkable violence. By the 1970s, Lopez had begun targeting young girls in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. His victims were often from impoverished families, making them easy prey for his manipulative charm. Lopez would lure these girls away, often under the guise of offering them gifts or food. Once he had them isolated, he would commit unspeakable acts of violence, ultimately strangling them to death. What makes Lopez's crimes even more horrifying is the sheer scale. He confessed to murdering over 300 girls, with 110 bodies discovered in Ecuador alone. Lopez's method was cold and calculated. He would scout rural areas, looking for children playing alone, and strike when no one was watching. In one chilling interview, Lopez described his crimes with an unsettling detachment, calling his victims angels, and claiming he was doing them a favor by sparing them from a harsh life. His lack of remorse was as disturbing as the crimes themselves. Lopez's reign of terror came to an end in 1980 when he attempted to abduct a young girl in Ecuador. Fortunately, her family intervened, capturing Lopez and handing him over to the police. At first, authorities dismissed him as just another petty criminal. But during questioning, Lopez began to confess, first to a handful of murders, then to dozens, and finally to hundreds. To verify his claims, police took Lopez to the locations where he said he had buried his victims. Shockingly, he led them to mass graves, where the remains of numerous young girls were unearthed. The sheer scale of his crimes left investigators and the public in disbelief. Despite his heinous crimes, the justice system failed to deliver the punishment many believed he deserved. In 1983, Lopez was convicted of 110 murders in Ecuador and sentenced to just 16 years in prison, the maximum penalty at the time. After serving only 14 years, he was released for good behavior. Lopez was deported to Colombia, where he was briefly institutionalized before being released again in 1998. Since then, his whereabouts have remained unknown, though rumors suggest he may have continued his killing spree. Pedro Lopez's case exposed glaring flaws in the legal systems of multiple countries and highlighted the challenges of dealing with cross-border serial killers. His story remains one of the most chilling reminders of how evil can sometimes slip through the cracks. While Pedro Lopez's crimes shook South America, our next story takes us back in time to 16th century Hungary, where another monster was hiding behind the walls of a castle. Meet Elizabeth Bathory, a woman whose thirst for power and blood earned her the title the Blood Countess. In the shadows of a 16th century Hungarian castle, A woman of nobility carried out acts so gruesome they would earn her a place in history as one of the most prolific female serial killers. This is the story of Elizabeth Bathory, a countess whose thirst for blood became the stuff of nightmares. Born in 1560 into one of Hungary's most powerful families, Elizabeth Bathory was destined for privilege, wealth, and influence. Her family was connected to royalty, and her upbringing reflected her aristocratic status. But beneath the veneer of nobility lay a darker side. From an early age, Elizabeth displayed signs of cruelty and sadistic tendencies. Some historians speculate that her behavior may have been influenced by her family's history of violence and mental illness. Stories suggest she witnessed brutal punishments inflicted on servants, and some even claim she participated in them as a child. At 15, Elizabeth married Ferenc Nadasdy, a Hungarian nobleman. While her husband was often away at war, Elizabeth managed the family estates, a role that would grant her unchecked power. It was during this time that rumors of her sadistic behavior began to surface. Elizabeth Bathory's crimes were as horrifying as they were methodical. She lured young peasant girls to her castle under the guise of offering them work as servants. Once inside, these girls were subjected to unspeakable torture. Witnesses later testified that Elizabeth would beat her victims, burn them with hot irons, and even bite chunks of flesh from their bodies. Some accounts claim she poured freezing water over her victims and left them to die in the cold, while others suggest she used needles to pierce their fingers and lips. The most infamous aspect of her legend, however, is the claim that Elizabeth bathed in the blood of her victims, believing it would preserve her youth and beauty. While historians debate the accuracy of this detail, there is no doubt that her crimes were monstrous. The number of her victims is staggering. Estimates range from 80 to over 600, though the exact figure remains unknown. Her reign of terror continued for years, shielded by her noble status and the fear she instilled in those around her. Elizabeth's crimes eventually became too egregious to ignore. In 1610, King Matthias II of Hungary ordered an investigation, led by a man named Georgi Thurzo. When Thurzo and his men raided Elizabeth's castle, they discovered a scene of horror. Bodies of young girls, some dead and others barely alive, bearing signs of severe torture. Elizabeth was arrested, but as a noblewoman, she was never formally tried. Instead, her accomplices, servants who had helped her carry out the murders, were put on trial and executed. Elizabeth, however, was sentenced to house arrest. She was confined to a small section of her castle, where she spent the remaining 4 years of her life. Elizabeth Bathory's crimes have left an indelible mark on history and folklore. She is often referred to as the Blood Countess, and has been linked to vampire legends due to her alleged obsession with blood. Her story has inspired countless books, films, and even video games, cementing her as one of history's most infamous figures. Beyond the legend, her case also serves as a chilling reminder of how power and privilege can shield individuals from justice. Had Elizabeth not been a member of the nobility, her reign of terror might have ended far sooner. Elizabeth Bathory's crimes may seem like something out of a gothic horror novel, but our next killer's story is just as horrifying, and all too real. Let's travel to Soviet Russia, where a man known as the Butcher of Rostov left a trail of terror that would haunt the nation for decades. Meet Andrei Chikatilo. Imagine a man who could blend in with the crowd, a seemingly ordinary figure, but underneath his unassuming exterior lurked a monster. A man who preyed on the most vulnerable, children, women, and the elderly, leaving behind a trail of unspeakable horror. This is the chilling story of Andrei Chikatilo, the Butcher of Rostov, whose brutal killings terrorized Soviet Russia for over a decade. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born on October 16, 1936, in the small village of Yablotn, in what was then the Soviet Union. His early life was marked by poverty and hardship. Chikatilo's family struggled to survive during the harsh years of World War II, and he grew up in an environment of scarcity and violence. From a young age, Chikatilo was different. He was shy, socially awkward, and often bullied by his peers. He also struggled with a deep sense of inadequacy, particularly when it came to his sexuality. As a young man, Chikatilo's attempts to engage with women were met with rejection, and he was often ridiculed for his impotence. Despite these difficulties, Chikatilo managed to secure a job as a teacher and later as an official at a local factory. On the surface, he seemed like a harmless, if somewhat eccentric, man. But beneath the surface, something far darker was festering. Chikatilo's first known murder occurred in 1978, but it wasn't until the 1980s that his killing spree truly escalated. His victims were predominantly young girls, but he also targeted boys and women. Chikatilo's method was horrifyingly consistent. He would lure his victims to remote areas, often pretending to be in need of help. Once alone with them, he would brutally assault, stab, and mutilate them. The details of his crimes are disturbingly graphic. Chikatilo was known to gouge out his victims' eyes, mutilate their genitalia, and in some cases, remove organs. He would often sexually assault the bodies of his victims after they had died, displaying an utter lack of empathy or remorse. His killing spree spanned across several cities, but his crimes were so grotesque that they often went unnoticed or were dismissed by authorities. The Butcher of Rostov moniker came from the region where Chikatilo committed many of his murders, Rostov-on-Don, a city in southern Russia. Over the years, his killing spree spread across the Soviet Union, leaving behind a trail of devastation that authorities failed to connect for far too long. For years, Chikatilo eluded capture, despite the growing body count. Investigators were baffled, and the authorities were desperate to catch the killer who was terrorizing the country. The Soviet government, eager to present an image of order and control, put immense pressure on law enforcement to find the killer. Initially, the police focused on the wrong suspects. They even arrested innocent men, including some who had been coerced into confessions through brutal interrogation tactics. But it wasn't until 1990 that Chikatilo was finally caught. The breakthrough came when investigators linked a series of murders in the Rostov region to a single suspect. Forensic evidence, including bloodstains and DNA samples, finally pointed to Chikatilo. He was arrested on November 20, 1990, after being caught in the act of attempting to lure another victim. In custody, Chikatilo initially denied his involvement in the murders. But when confronted with the overwhelming evidence, he confessed to 56 murders, though some estimates suggest the actual number could be higher. His confession was chilling in its detail, and he showed no remorse for his actions. Chikatilo's arrest and subsequent trial sent shockwaves through Soviet society. His crimes were so grotesque that they exposed the flaws in the Soviet justice system, particularly the failure to connect the murders over the years. The investigation was criticized for its mishandling, and many innocent men were wrongfully imprisoned before Chikatilo was identified as the true killer. The case also highlighted the growing concerns about crime and the ability of law enforcement to protect citizens in the Soviet Union. Chikatilo's trial was one of the most high-profile in Soviet history, and it became a symbol of the deep cracks in the country's criminal justice system. Chikatilo was sentenced to death in 1992, and he was executed by a single gunshot to the back of the head. His legacy lives on as one of the most notorious serial killers in history, and his story continues to fascinate true crime enthusiasts around the world. Chikatilo's reign of terror may have ended in the Soviet Union, but the horrors of serial killing didn't stop there. Our next story takes us to the United States, where a woman named Aileen Wuornos would become one of the most infamous female serial killers in history. Her story is one of tragedy, survival, and chilling violence. Her name is synonymous with one of the most chilling and controversial cases in true crime history. A woman who was labeled a cold-blooded killer, yet some argue she was a victim of circumstance. Aileen Wuornos, the highway killer, whose violent acts would leave the nation questioning the line between victim and perpetrator. Aileen Carol Wuornos was born on February 29, 1956, in Troy, Michigan. Her early life was filled with trauma and neglect. Her father, a convicted child molester, was incarcerated before she was born, and her mother abandoned her when she was just a child. Raised by her grandparents, Wuornos experienced constant emotional abuse and rejection, setting the stage for a troubled adulthood. At the age of 14, Wuornos was sexually assaulted by a man, an event that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She became pregnant as a result of the assault, but the child was put up for adoption. Afterward, Wuorno's life spiraled further into violence and despair. She turned to prostitution to survive, often using sex work as a means of coping with her inner demons. Despite numerous attempts to form relationships, Wuorno struggled with deep psychological issues, including anger, depression, and a sense of abandonment. Her relationships were short-lived, often ending in violence. It was clear that Aileen Wuornos was a woman haunted by her past, struggling to find her place in a world that had long since failed her. Aileen Wuornos' killing spree began in 1989 and lasted until 1990. As a prostitute working along Florida's highways, she would pick up men looking for sex, but instead of providing her services, she would shoot them dead. Over the course of a year, Wuornos killed 7 men, each one shot at close range in their cars. Her victims were often men who picked her up for sex in remote areas. Wuornos claimed that she killed them in self-defense after they attempted to assault her. In some of her confessions, she stated that she felt trapped, with no way out of the violent situations she found herself in. But there were inconsistencies in her story, and many of her actions seemed far from self-defense. Wuornos' method of murder was brutal and direct. She would shoot her victims with a .22 caliber handgun, often leaving their bodies discarded by the side of the road. She then stole their money and belongings, using the proceeds to fund her own survival. The media quickly dubbed her the Highway Killer, and her case became a national sensation. Some saw her as a victim of a cruel world, while others viewed her as a ruthless killer. Her trial would become a media circus, and her actions sparked debates about the treatment of women, the criminal justice system, and the fine line between victim and perpetrator. Wuorno's killing spree came to an end in January 1991 when she was arrested after a routine traffic stop. She had been caught trying to sell one of her victims' belongings. During questioning, Wuornos initially denied involvement in the murders, but when confronted with evidence, she confessed to the killings. Her trial was marked by sensational headlines and intense media scrutiny. Wuornos pleaded guilty to 6 of the murders and was sentenced to death. Her defense team argued that she was a victim of abuse and that her actions were a result of years of trauma. However, the court found her guilty, and she was sentenced to death by lethal injection. In her final years, Wuornos became a symbol of the debate over the death penalty, with some arguing that she was mentally ill and should not have been executed. She was executed on October 9, 2002, after spending over a decade on death row. Aileen Wuornos' case remains one of the most controversial in the history of serial killings. Some view her as a tragic figure, a woman who was driven to murder by years of abuse and exploitation. Others see her as a cold-blooded killer who took advantage of her circumstances to justify her actions. Her story has been the subject of numerous documentaries, books, and films, most notably the 2003 movie Monster, which portrayed Wuornos' life and crimes. Her case continues to spark debate about the criminal justice system, mental illness, and the treatment of women in society. Aileen Wuornos' tragic story may have ended in execution, but her case sparked a nationwide conversation about justice and victimhood. Now, we turn to a man whose crimes were far more insidious, a doctor who used his position of trust to carry out his murderous acts. Meet Harold Shipman, also known as Dr. Death, whose legacy of death would shock the medical world to its core. He was a trusted physician, a pillar of the community, and a man who took an oath to do no harm. But behind the white coat and medical credentials, Harold Shipman was a monster, responsible for one of the most horrifying killing sprees in modern history. A man who used his position of power to take the lives of those who trusted him most. This is the chilling story of Dr. Death. Harold Frederick Shipman was born on January 14, 1946, in Nottingham, England. He was the son of a working-class family, and from an early age, he was known to be bright, ambitious, and determined. He was drawn to medicine, and by the age of 17, Shipman had already decided to become a doctor. However, his early life was not without trauma. Shipman's mother, who he was very close to, died of lung cancer when he was just 17 years old. Her death, which he witnessed firsthand, would have a profound impact on him, possibly shaping his later views on life and death. After completing medical school, Shipman began his career as a general practitioner, GP, in a small town in England. He quickly gained a reputation as a compassionate and skilled doctor, but beneath the surface, something far more sinister was brewing. Shipman's killing spree spanned over 2 decades, though it wasn't until the late 1990s that his crimes began to unravel. He used his position as a trusted family doctor to kill his patients, most of whom were elderly women. Shipman would often administer lethal doses of painkillers or other drugs, making their deaths appear natural or accidental. His method of murder was disturbingly methodical. He would visit his patients at home, sometimes injecting them with lethal doses of heroin or other drugs, then leave the scene, allowing them to die quietly. He often falsified death certificates, attributing the deaths to natural causes such as heart attacks or strokes. It wasn't until 1998 that suspicions began to arise. A local undertaker, who had noticed the unusually high number of deaths in Shipman's practice, alerted authorities. Investigations revealed that Shipman had been responsible for the deaths of at least 215 people, though some estimates suggest the true number could be much higher. The breakthrough in the investigation came when a woman named Kathleen Grundy died suddenly after visiting Shipman for a routine checkup. Her daughter, suspicious of the circumstances, began to investigate further. She discovered that Shipman had forged her mother's will, leaving everything to himself. This discovery led to a full-scale investigation, and in 1998, Shipman was arrested. During his trial, evidence mounted against him, including testimonies from former colleagues, medical records, and forensic evidence linking him to the deaths. He was convicted of 15 murders, but it is believed that he may have been responsible for many more. Shipman's trial shocked the public, and the revelation that a doctor, someone trusted to care for others, had been responsible for so many deaths sent ripples through the medical community. Shipman was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Harold Shipman's case remains one of the most shocking in the history of serial killings. His actions exposed vulnerabilities in the medical profession and led to sweeping reforms in how doctors are monitored and how deaths are investigated. Shipman's legacy is one of betrayal, as he used his position of trust to murder those who were most vulnerable. His case also sparked debates about the ethics of medical professionals and the responsibility of healthcare systems to prevent such crimes. In 2004, while serving his life sentence, Shipman was found dead in his prison cell, an apparent suicide. His death, though it ended his reign of terror, left many questions unanswered. How many victims did he truly have? Could his killing spree have been stopped earlier? These questions remain unanswered, and the true extent of his crimes may never be fully known. Harold Shipman's case is a chilling reminder of the power that trust can give a person, and how easily it can be exploited for evil. But not all serial killers operate in the shadows. Some are so brazen in their horrific acts that they become legends. Our next killer, Albert Fish, was one such man, a figure so disturbing, his crimes would haunt the world for generations. Let's delve into the case of the Gray Man. He was known as the Gray Man, a name that evokes an image of an unassuming, elderly man, someone you would pass by without a second thought. But behind his harmless exterior lurked one of the most depraved serial killers in history. Albert Fish's crimes were so grotesque, they defy belief. This is the story of a man who found pleasure in the most unimaginable horrors. Albert Fish was born Hamilton Howard Fish on May 19, 1870, in Washington, D.C. His early life was marked by tragedy and instability. His father, a mentally unstable man, died when Fish was just a child, leaving him and his siblings to be raised by their mother. Fish's childhood was filled with abuse and neglect. He was sent to an orphanage at the age of 5, where he was subjected to physical and emotional abuse. It was during these formative years that Fish began to exhibit disturbing behaviors. He developed a fascination with pain and suffering, particularly the idea of inflicting harm on others. As Fish grew older, his behavior became increasingly erratic. He moved to New York City, where he worked a variety of jobs, including as a house painter. It was during this time that Fish's darker urges began to manifest in horrifying ways. Fish's killing spree began in the early 1920s, but it wasn't until 1928 that he committed the crime that would ultimately lead to his capture. His victims were typically young children, whom he would lure away from their homes with promises of food, money, or work. Once he had gained their trust, Fish would abduct them, taking them to secluded locations where he would commit unspeakable acts of torture, mutilation, and cannibalism. One of his most infamous crimes was the abduction and murder of 10-year-old Grace Budd in 1928. Fish had been following Grace for some time before he invited her to a party at his house. Once there, he murdered her, dismembered her body, and ate parts of it. He later sent a letter to Grace's parents, describing in graphic detail what he had done to their daughter. Fish's crimes were not limited to murder. He was also a known sadist, deriving sexual pleasure from the pain and suffering of others. His penchant for cannibalism and the grotesque mutilation of his victims shocked even the most hardened investigators. Fish's reign of terror came to an end in 1934 when he was arrested for the murder of another child, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney. A witness had seen Fish with the boy, and police were able to trace the crime back to him. After his arrest, Fish confessed to the murders of at least 5 children, though he claimed to have committed many more. His confessions were chilling in their detail, and he provided investigators with a wealth of information about his crimes. Fish's trial was a media sensation, with the public horrified by the details of his crimes. He was convicted of the murder of Grace Budd and sentenced to death. Albert Fish's case remains one of the most disturbing in the history of serial killers. His crimes shocked the world, and his name became synonymous with unspeakable horror. Fish's legacy is one of pure evil. He was a man who took pleasure in the suffering of children, a monster who was beyond comprehension. Fish was executed by electric chair on January 16, 1936, at Sing Sing prison. His death, though it ended his reign of terror, did little to ease the pain of the families he had destroyed. His case remains a chilling reminder of the depths of human depravity. Albert Fish's crimes left a permanent scar on the public consciousness, but the darkness of serial murder did not end with him. Our next killer, Richard Ramirez, took terror to a whole new level. Known as the Night Stalker, Ramirez's killing spree would send shockwaves through California, leaving a trail of death and fear that would haunt the state for years. Let's explore the terrifying story of Richard Ramirez. Under the cover of darkness, he stalked the streets, a shadow in the night. His victims never saw him coming, and once he was done, they were left in a state of terror and confusion. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, was a name that struck fear into the hearts of Californians during the 1980s. A man whose crimes would become the stuff of nightmares. This is the terrifying story of a killer who used the night as his cloak, and terror as his weapon. Richard Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas. Raised in a family plagued by violence, poverty, and dysfunction, Ramirez's early life was marked by abuse. His father was an alcoholic who regularly beat him, and his childhood home was filled with crime and chaos. By his teenage years, Ramirez was already experimenting with drugs and developing an obsession with violence. He idolized his older cousin, a man who had served in the Vietnam War, and was involved in a series of brutal murders. This influence seemed to solidify Ramirez's dark path, and he began to act out his violent fantasies. Ramirez moved to California in the early 1980s, where he would eventually begin his killing spree. His background in crime, coupled with his growing fascination with Satanism, set the stage for a series of murders that would terrorize Southern California. Richard Ramirez's killing spree began in 1984 and continued until his capture in 1985. His victims were random, chosen without any clear pattern other than their vulnerability. Ramirez would break into homes, often in the dead of night, and murder his victims in their beds. He used a variety of weapons, including guns, knives, and blunt objects, and would often sexually assault his victims before killing them. Ramirez's modus operandi was terrifying in its unpredictability. He would leave behind strange symbols, including pentagrams, at crime scenes, often with the words Satan or Satanic scrawled on walls in the victim's blood. This led many to believe that his crimes were driven by satanic beliefs, though Ramirez himself never fully explained his motivations. The murders were brutal, and his victims included both men and women of various ages. Ramirez's attacks were often random, which only added to the fear that gripped the community. He would often leave his victims alive, only to return later to finish the job. His ability to evade capture for so long made him even more terrifying. The investigation into Ramirez's crimes was intense, but for over a year, the police were unable to catch him. Ramirez's ability to blend in with the crowds, along with the lack of solid evidence, made it difficult for authorities to track him down. However, in August 1985, Ramirez's luck ran out. A group of residents in East Los Angeles recognized him from a police sketch and chased him down, eventually cornering him and holding him until the police arrived. During his trial, Ramirez showed no remorse for his actions. He proudly declared his allegiance to Satan and showed no signs of regret for the lives he had taken. He was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, and 11 sexual assaults, and was sentenced to death. Richard Ramirez's case sent shockwaves through California and the United States. His reign of terror, which lasted over a year, created an atmosphere of fear and paranoia. The media dubbed him the Night Stalker, and his image became synonymous with the terror of the 1980s. His case also raised important questions about the role of the media in sensationalizing crimes, as well as the psychological profile of serial killers. Ramirez's lack of remorse and his embrace of Satanism made him one of the most disturbing figures in true crime history. Ramirez spent more than 2 decades on death row before dying of complications from cancer in 2013. His legacy remains one of terror, as he continues to be remembered as one of the most frightening serial killers of the modern era. Richard Ramirez's reign of terror in California may have ended, but his name lives on as a symbol of fear and chaos. Our next killer, Dorothea Puente, was a woman whose actions would turn the very idea of trust upside down. As a landlady, she opened her home to vulnerable individuals, only to become a murderer who preyed on those in her care. This is the disturbing case of the Death House landlady. She was the epitome of kindness, an elderly woman who ran a boarding house, offering a safe haven for the homeless, the elderly, and the vulnerable. But behind the warm smile and welcoming demeanor, Dorothea Puente was hiding a dark secret. A secret that would lead to the deaths of several of her tenants, turning her home into a house of horrors. This is the chilling story of the Death House landlady. Dorothea Puente was born on January 9, 1929, in Red Bluff, California. Her early life was marked by tragedy and hardship. She was abandoned by her parents and grew up in a series of foster homes. By her teenage years, Puente had already developed a history of petty crimes, including theft and fraud. In her adult years, Puente moved to Sacramento, where she began a new life as a boarding house operator. She became known for her charitable nature, offering rooms to those in need. Many saw her as a kind, caring woman who genuinely wanted to help those who had fallen on hard times. But beneath her facade of compassion, Puente was harboring a much darker side. She was a woman driven by greed and a disturbing desire for control over others. Over the years, she would use her position as a landlady to prey on her vulnerable tenants, ultimately turning her home into a place of death. Puente's crimes began in the 1980s, though she had been involved in criminal activity for years prior. She would often target elderly men and women, as well as those with mental disabilities. Puente would take in tenants, promising them a safe place to stay, only to exploit them for her own gain. Her method of murder was both cold and calculated. Puente would poison her victims, often using overdoses of drugs such as arsenic or other lethal substances. After their deaths, she would cash their social security checks and continue to collect money from their accounts, all while pretending that her tenants had simply disappeared. In some cases, Puente would dismember the bodies of her victims, hiding the remains in her home or in the yard. The authorities were initially unaware of the murders, as Puente had carefully covered her tracks. but suspicion began to grow when several of her tenants went missing. The investigation into Puente's crimes began in 1988, when one of her tenants, a mentally disabled man named William, was reported missing. As detectives looked into his disappearance, they began to uncover the truth about Puente's other tenants who had also gone missing under suspicious circumstances. The breakthrough came when a social worker named Judy, who had been visiting Puente's home, noticed the strange behavior of the landlady and began to investigate further. After a thorough search of the property, authorities discovered human remains buried in the yard. Puente was arrested and charged with the murders of at least 9 people, though the true number of victims remains uncertain. During her trial, Puente showed no remorse for her actions and even attempted to claim that she had been caring for her victims by helping them die peacefully. Dorothea Puente's case shocked the public, as it was difficult to reconcile the image of the sweet, elderly landlady with the gruesome crimes she had committed. Her case raised important questions about how easily people can be deceived by appearances and how those in positions of trust can exploit the vulnerable for their own gain. Puente was convicted of 3 murders in 1993, though it is believed that she may have been responsible for more. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Puente died in 2011 at the age of 82, but her legacy as one of the most notorious female serial killers remains intact. Dorothea Puente's case serves as a grim reminder that evil can hide behind even the most unsuspecting faces. But not all killers are so overtly deceptive. Our next killer, Dennis Nilsen, was a man whose kind and gentle persona masked a chilling capacity for violence. Known as the kindly killer, Nilsen's crimes were as methodical as they were horrifying. Let's delve into the case of Dennis Nilsen. He was a man who appeared to be gentle, polite, and even kind. Dennis Nilsen was the sort of person you'd expect to see at a quiet dinner party, offering a helping hand to those in need. But behind his unassuming demeanor lay a dark and twisted soul, capable of committing unspeakable acts of violence. Nilsen's crimes would go unnoticed for years, and when they were finally uncovered, they would reveal a man whose kindness was nothing more than a mask for his chilling desire to kill. Dennis Nilsen was born on November 23, 1945, in Fraserburgh, Scotland. His early life was marked by emotional trauma. His parents' troubled marriage and the death of his mother left Nilsen feeling abandoned and isolated. He grew up with a deep sense of loneliness, which would later influence his violent tendencies. As a young man, Nilsen struggled with his sexuality and often found himself in relationships that were short-lived and emotionally strained. He joined the British Army, where he served as a police officer, but his time in the military was uneventful. It was after leaving the army that Nilsen began to develop his darker urges. He moved to London, where he worked in various jobs, including as a civil servant. Despite his seemingly normal life, Nilsen began to act on his violent fantasies. He would lure young men into his home, often offering them alcohol or a place to stay, before strangling them and carrying out gruesome acts of post-mortem mutilation. Nilsen's killing spree began in 1978 and lasted until his capture in 1983. His victims were typically young men, many of whom were homeless or vulnerable. Nilsen would often meet them at bars or on the streets, offering them food or a place to stay. Once they were in his home, he would strangle them, sometimes using a tie or his hands, before performing acts of necrophilia and dismembering the bodies. Nilsen's method of disposal was methodical. He would store the bodies in his apartment, often in cupboards or under the floorboards, keeping them for days or even weeks before dismembering them. He would then burn the remains in his fireplace or flush them down the toilet. Nilsen's crimes were chilling in their meticulousness. He would often engage in conversations with the bodies, speaking to them as if they were still alive. His actions were not only driven by sexual desire but also by a deep need for control over his victims. Nilsen's killing spree went undetected for years, as his victims were often transient or homeless, making it difficult for authorities to connect the disappearances. However, in 1983, the discovery of human remains in Nilsen's apartment led to his arrest. A police officer had been called to investigate a blocked drain, and when they opened the drain, they discovered body parts. After a search of Nilsen's apartment, police found further evidence of his crimes, including photographs and remnants of the dismembered bodies. Nilsen was arrested and confessed to the murders of at least 12 men, though some estimates suggest the number could be higher. During his trial, he was convicted of 6 murders and 2 attempted murders, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Dennis Nilsen's case shocked the public and law enforcement alike. His ability to blend into society, all while hiding such horrific acts, made him one of the most chilling serial killers in modern history. Nilsen's crimes also raised questions about the nature of necrophilia and the psychology of serial killers, particularly those who target vulnerable individuals. Nilsen was sentenced to life imprisonment in 1983, and he died in 2018. His legacy remains as a reminder of how even the most outwardly kind individuals can harbor the darkest of secrets. While Dennis Nilsen's crimes shocked the world, his name is still far less infamous than the one that still haunts the streets of London. Our next killer, Jack the Ripper, is often regarded as the original serial killer, a figure who has left an indelible mark on history. His identity remains a mystery to this day, but his gruesome murders continue to captivate and terrify. Let's delve into the story of Jack the Ripper, the killer who changed the face of crime forever. Imagine the foggy streets of Victorian London, where the gas lamps cast an eerie glow over the alleys. In the darkness, a killer stalks his victims, leaving behind a trail of blood and terror. Jack the Ripper, a name that still sends chills down the spine, was the first serial killer to truly capture the world's imagination. His brutal murders remain unsolved, and his identity is one of the greatest mysteries in criminal history. This is the story of Jack the Ripper, the killer who terrorized London and changed the way we think about crime forever. Little is known about Jack the Ripper's early life, and that's part of what makes him so terrifying. His true identity has never been confirmed, and there are countless theories about who he might have been. Some believe he was a doctor, others a butcher, and some even suggest he was a member of the royal family. What we do know is that he operated in the Whitechapel district of London in 1888, a time when the area was known for its poverty, crime, and overcrowding. The city was in the midst of an industrial revolution, and Whitechapel was a place where the poor lived in squalor. Many of the women who fell victim to the Ripper were sex workers, and it's believed that the killer targeted them because they were seen as expendable by society. Despite the brutal nature of his crimes, there was no real public outcry until it was too late. The Ripper's killing spree began in August 1888, with the murder of Mary Ann Nichols, and it ended in November of the same year with the death of Mary Jane Kelly. Over the course of just a few months, the Ripper claimed the lives of at least 5 women, though some believe there may have been more victims. His victims, often referred to as the Canonical Five, were all murdered in the same brutal manner. The Ripper would slit their throats, then mutilate their bodies, removing organs in some cases. The level of violence and the precision with which he carried out the killings suggested that he had some knowledge of anatomy, leading many to believe he was a medical professional or had some surgical training. The most chilling aspect of the murders was the Ripper's ability to evade capture. Despite numerous investigations, police were never able to catch him. He taunted the authorities with letters, some of which were believed to have been written by him, though the authenticity of these letters is still debated. His last known victim, Mary Jane Kelly, was killed in her own room, and the crime scene was so gruesome that it's said to have left even the most seasoned detectives horrified. The investigation into the Ripper's crimes was one of the largest and most extensive in history. The police had very little to go on, and the case was plagued by false leads, hoaxes, and public hysteria. Several suspects were put forward over the years, including a local butcher, a doctor, and even a man who claimed to be the killer in a letter to the police. Despite these leads, the police were unable to catch the killer. The case was complicated by the fact that forensic science was still in its infancy, and the lack of physical evidence made it nearly impossible to identify the murderer. In the end, the case went cold, and Jack the Ripper became a legend, his identity still unknown. The mystery surrounding Jack the Ripper has never been solved, and this has only added to his infamy. He is often regarded as the first true serial killer, and his crimes have had a lasting impact on both popular culture and criminal investigations. The Ripper's case helped to shape modern forensic techniques, and his name has become synonymous with terror and unsolved mysteries. The fear and fascination with Jack the Ripper have endured for over a century, and his story continues to captivate audiences around the world. Theories about his identity still abound, with many books, documentaries, and films attempting to solve the case. But the truth remains elusive, and Jack the Ripper continues to haunt the streets of London, a ghost from the past whose legacy still lingers. From the shadowed alleys of London to the quiet streets of small towns, the serial killers we've uncovered today serve as a haunting reminder of the darkest sides of humanity. While some were caught, others remained shrouded in mystery, leaving us with questions that may never be answered. But one thing is clear: their actions have forever changed the way we view crime, fear, and justice. The victims' stories, though tragic, continue to shape our understanding of the criminal mind and the chilling capacity for evil that exists in the world. If you found these stories as unsettling and captivating as we did, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a deep dive into the darkest corners of true crime. And if you have any thoughts or theories about these killers, or if you want us to cover a specific case next, drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more chilling tales from the world of true crime.